airtight walls in the real world. WRBs, flashing and redundancy. Now that we've gone over the basics of how heat, air, and moisture can move through building assemblies, or at least how they work, we can look at how to control them and make them do what we want. So I'm going to explore a couple of ways to improve the layers that are already in the blueprints, starting on the outside of the wall with the house wrap, or WRB, as it's called in the code. In the code, they call it WRB as a water-resistant barrier, but building scientists call a WRB a weather-resistant barrier. The main difference is that weather is different from water because weather includes wind and different pressures. So a weather-resistant barrier incorporates wind and air pressures into the performance of that outer layer, which is protecting the framing. So first we'll look at house wrap as a WRB. House wrap initially is a water-resistant barrier. If you want to upgrade it to an air barrier, weather barrier, you can just do a couple of little things to make it much more airtight. As usual, the tricky stuff isn't in the middle of the wall where there's no action, where there's no windows, no holes. The tricky stuff is where two different things meet or two perpendicular things meet. So like where wood and concrete meet or where a roof and a wall meet. However, if in the middle of the walls, there are seams in the house wrap, which should be sealed and overlapped correctly. So there's a little bit of action in the middle of the wall. Horizontal seams in house wrap are air leaks and potential water leaks. Unless they're sealed, air is certainly moving through them. They say they're potential water leaks because if they're overlapped correctly, they probably won't leak any water, but it's really common to see people underlap house wrap on a house, even though carpenters are supposed to know that water flows downhill. One way to cut down on airflow through a WRB is to seal all of the seams. So manufacturers recommend using contractor tape. One of the high performance builders that we're going to feature here from Boston uses caulk to do the horizontal seams because at one time he had been using tape and water got behind the siding as it does, and it got onto the WRB, which it was supposed to do, rolled down the WRB and hit a fisheye in the tape, and it got inside the tape, traveled sideways until it reached the end of the tape, which was at a window. So this tape was like a funnel that was dumping water into the window. David was stunned that his windows were leaking when he got the call back because his crew is so good at flashing, but it wasn't a window that was leaking at all. It was a piece of tape over a cap staple somewhere in the middle of the wall. So now he doesn't use tape. He just overlaps the seams and runs a bead of caulk behind the lap. I don't know if you know who Doug Horgan is. You've probably seen him from JLC live events if you go to that, or if you read JLC magazine, you've seen him in there. He's got a series of great videos on YouTube of himself giving best practice presentations to job supervisors at BOA, which is a large remodeling firm in DC and Northern Virginia. He and I converted a bunch of those videos into articles for Pro Tradecraft, and I'm going to kind of summarize the one on house wraps here. Doug says that house wrap matters because siding materials leak. Brick, stone, wood, EIFS, vinyl. House wrap has to protect the structure from siding leaks. And siding doesn't leak because it's bad. Siding leaks because people install it. And people don't install things poorly because they're bad. They install things poorly because they don't know the best way to do it and why it matters often. So when people know how and why, they generally take pride in doing a superior job. So this is an animation based on Doug's installation advice for house wrap and the basics of controlling water and air.
Weather barriers done right means weather barriers that go to work on more than just the sunny days. Weather includes moisture, wind, and rain, so it makes sense that a weather barrier would aim to stop all of that, because it's not always sunny like it is in animation land. Begin at the bottom of the wall where the house wrap is sealed to the foundation with silicone caulk to bridge the gaps between wood and concrete. Anyone who's ever run siding knows that if the house wrap isn't tight in the corners, it'll get sliced with a utility knife. So get it tight or say goodbye to your air barrier. Overlap the vertical seams 6 to 12 inches. Here, the house wrap is run all the way into the corner and the next piece run out about 1.5 feet because there's a couple of wall elevations at the bottom and the installers wanted to get a good overlap. Tape the seam with contractor tape. Run a bead of caulk along the top of the wall to seal the top of the house wrap. Sometimes it's easier to do this after the house wrap has been placed. Either way, overlap the higher pieces in front of the lower pieces so that water is always directed out. And don't stop at the top of the insulated space. House wrap is the drainage plane on gables too, so it has to cover all of the wall sheathing. It's a good idea to tape the seams before going too crazy with the cap stapler because a partially taped over cap can become a water injection system into the tape, which can become a trough for sideways water movement. So keep the cap staples away from the tape. The same is true at windows where there's a lot of flashing tape. Keep the cap staples about 1 foot away from the opening on each edge and leave plenty of room to splice the window into the wall. Another sneaky spot that can turn into a massive air leak is a cantilever. At a minimum, cover this opening with house wrap, but something rigid is better, like wall sheathing. Of course, both sheathing and house wrap is best, and that detail is a topic for another video.
So that's sort of a how to do it in the perfect world animation. But unlike animation land, the real world has mud and ladders and guys with tattoos climbing ladders with mud on their boots. So here's a real crew doing it in a pretty good sized addition to a 100-year-old house that I shot a little while ago.
Welcome to Pro Tradecraft's Weatherization Nation, a show about building smart from the start. Last week, we made a cold, wet hole into a warm and dry crawl space using Thermax polyiso foam board and smart plastic strategies.
Because we found that when we do this and we have the gravel down, as you're working on it, you stretch it out and you're walking on top of it, sometimes you can start to tear, rip, or puncture your plastic. So what we do is we take some of the leftover stuff that we've got, put a couple strips down, so that way when we put our 6mm or 8mm on top of it, and you're walking on top of it, you're not actually creating holes in your vapor barriers.
They sealed the new crawl space to the old building with great stuff and moved on to the framing. In this episode, we're going to learn why the WRB is such a BFD.
What we're talking about today are weather-resistant barriers. Back in the day, that used to be tar paper. Tar paper would dry out and crack. It did not handle weather or UV very well. Nowadays, we have longer spans between putting up our siding and our windows and doors. Important factors about the WRB, weather-resistant barrier, it's an air and water barrier. So when it rains, the rain drains down the side of it. It's going to continually move water away from the house. Another thing that's really important about a WRB is its permeability, which means the amount of vapor that it can transfer through. A lot of times during construction, it's built during rainy days or weather, and you want that plywood to be able to dry out over and not be stuck behind a vapor barrier that won't allow any moisture out.
Okay, let's pause a second to make a point of that. Pro Tradecraft travels all over the country to job sites, and we see this on blueprints a lot. In fact, Tyvek is not a vapor barrier.
It allows vapor to pass through it and dry out through diffusion. A vapor barrier would be like a solid piece of plastic that is not going to allow any air or moisture through it. It is a water and air barrier. It allows vapor to pass through it through permeability. Tyvek is not a vapor barrier.
Now that we've cleared that up, let's move to animation land for a strategy session. The general strategy for using house wrap as a water barrier is to cover all the seams and gaps in the exterior sheathing, overlapping correctly. To upgrade Tyvek to an air barrier, seal the top and bottom as well as the vertical and horizontal seams. Each layer should overlap to the outside so that water is continually directed away from the house. Seams are sealed against air leaks, and the WRB should extend all the way to the bottom of the roof deck for a continuous air and water barrier. Begin the process at the bottom. Make sure to seal the wall sheathing to the foundation with flashing tape. The WRB should overlap that seal. Next, they staple the bottom corner, tack the top, and then roll out the Tyvek, aligning the bottom to where it should be and stapling minimally to make sure to get a smooth, tight fit. With the bottom tight, Ray works his way up the sheet to staple it off using a cap stapler.
There are several reasons here to use cap staples and cap nails. A larger area of space holding it to the building, therefore less likely for wind to rip it away. Secondly, as water travels down the building towards the cap, it is more likely to hit the cap and travel around the staple instead of an old school slap stapler that may have damaged your WRB and provided an opening for water to get in. Another thing just to be careful of when you're putting in your cap staples, you want to keep this away from any of your flashing. Anything where your flashing is going to go up against it and create a void behind it, it provides an area for water to leak in and get into. You also don't want to run your seam tape over top any of these caps, as that will provide a bad adhesion and water can work its way into the building as well.
At the end, where the WRB meets the existing house, they cut the Tyvek tight into the corner and staple it home. Later, they'll cut about an inch off the end of the Tyvek and use flashing tape to bridge the WRB to the wall sheathing for an airtight connection. Ray can finish off the stapling now that the WRB is where it ought to be.
On this next row here, what we're going to do is we're going to overlap a minimum of 6 inches. In most building practices, you want to overlap every product that you put on. That way, if water runs down the front of the building, it's going to continually be pushed to the outside. You never want to have a situation of reverse flashing, which would direct water into the building where it cannot dry out.
They cut the pieces to length on the ground and then install the upper course off ladders, stapling the bottom in place first and then moving up. Victor puts a couple of staples in the top corner, holds the sheet tight, and then moves to the opposite end to pull it into place. With the corners tight, he can staple off the bottom and the field, spacing staples about every 16 inches. The same process holds for the other walls. Cut the sheet to length on the ground, fasten the bottom corner, and then align the top corner. On this wall, Victor can wrap the corner, beginning at the top, moving to the bottom, and then hitting the in-between parts. They pull the bottom tight, staple it, and move to the last corner, the top right. Sometimes you need to adjust from where the initial staples were, which is one reason not to staple in the field until the whole sheet is in place and in good shape. Again, overlapping the corners at least 6 inches stops sideways wind and water from sneaking into the wall system. Seams are taped against air leaks, being careful not to tape over a cap staple, which can cause a fish mouth in the tape. A J-roller or squeegee will wet the adhesive of the tape into the Tyvek. Most construction tapes and flashings are pressure sensitive, so it's important to roll them onto the substrate. Finally, they fill in the gable end the same way they did the rest. Cut it to length, place the bottom of the sheet, spread it out. In this case, they cut it in place, staple it off, and seal the seams. With the final piece in place, that's what we call a wrap. For the day and for the house. With a perfectly installed WRB, we're ready to cut some holes in it for windows. which will be flashed and sealed into place for an airtight, watertight seal. And we'll do that in depth in the next episode of Weatherization Nation.
So that's WRB that comes on a roll, house wrap. Not all WRBs come on a roll. Some of them are already part of the wall sheathing, like zip system sheathing, the green stuff and brown. And now I think LP has a version of that too. I think it's called Weather Logic, kind of bluish color. So the critical part of these systems is sealing the seams in the panel and dealing with holes and transitions. This is done either usually with flashing tape or more and more with fluid applied flashing products. And the brands are usually proprietary to the system that you're using. So the tape or the fluid flashing becomes a really important piece of the air barrier and the water barrier of this wall, the control layers. A lot of people are skeptical of a system that relies on tape, but if the tape's installed well, it should work fine for a very long time. And as I noted in the previous one on house wrap, it's important to roll it in to wet the adhesive into the surface. I want to take a closer look at how tape works for a little while before we go in deeper on the built-in WRB systems, because the tape is really pretty important to the whole system. So we have a 7 minutes of BS episode on viscoelasticity, which was a lot of fun to record and fun to say. I recorded it live at Building Science Summer Camp, hanging out by the horseshoe pits with an engineer who specializes in adhesives, and he described how tape works. So I'm not going to play the podcast here, and I didn't make a video of it. Instead, I'm just going to summarize it for you. So many people think that what causes tape to be sticky is some sort of a chemical reaction or a chemical bond, but it's not that. It's actually like a physical three-dimensional bond, like what you get with lath and plaster, where the plaster keys into the lath substrate. And viscoelasticity drives that three-dimensional bond. Viscosity of an adhesive is what allows it to wet out into the substrate. And I say wet out, I use air quotes because it's a term that engineers use. Elasticity is what allows the adhesive to resist separation when a force is applied to it. So the tape needs to stick to the wall sheathing, but the adhesive also needs to stick to itself. Otherwise, the tape would fall off and you just have a bunch of sticky gunk on the wall. So there's basically two molecular forces at play: adhesive forces and cohesive forces. The adhesive force bonds dissimilar molecules together, so the tape molecules and the plywood molecules, kind of like the tongue in the flagpole, but different. And the cohesive force holds similar or the same types of molecules together. So the adhesive molecules are attracted to themselves. Adhesion sticks the tape to the wall, cohesion keeps it there. Most of these tapes are pressure sensitive adhesive. So people often overlook the need for applying, often overlook the need for applying the pressure to get the tape to stick. But it's that pressure that activates the viscosity in the adhesive, and it allows it to flow into the substrate, whatever that substrate is, OSB, framing lumber. So you need pressure to engage or get the adhesive moving so that it has the ability to wet out into the substrate and work its way into the voids of the material. The pressure can come from using a J roller or a plastic squeegee or some other tool that will mash the tape into the surface so that the adhesive can blanket the topography of that surface. So not only does it prevent fish mouths and wrinkles in the tape, but it kicks in the viscous flow, allowing the tape to actually stick and work its way into the nooks of the substrate and really hold on, grab onto it. I'm going over this in detail not because it's my passion and that I think everyone should be a tape freak, but because it's something that I do not see very much on job sites. Carpenters rolling or squeegeeing or otherwise mashing the tape into the thing they want it to stick to. They just put it up and then a lot of times they complain about tape not working. So that's how you're supposed to install the tape. Now let's look at some practical information. For walls without house wrap, like the green walls with baked in WRB, you can't overlap house wraps over the penetrations. You need to use tape or liquid flashing. So here's a quick animation on how to flash various penetrations in a wall like that.
If you use wall sheathing with a pre-applied weather barrier, such as zip system, or if you paint on the weather barrier, then you may be at a bit of a loss on how to seal holes through the walls made by others during the course of construction. The first thing to do is tape the seams of the panels to keep air and water out. Use a J-roller to make a solid bond. Many of these tapes are pressure sensitive, so you really need to mash them into the sheathing. The simplest way to flash an electrical box is to tape the bottom, the sides, and then the top, in that order. Other box-shaped penetrations should be flashed the same way. Bottom, sides, and then top. Framing that penetrates through a wall needs some sort of saddle flashing. If you have fancy stretch tape, just flash the bottom of the framing to the wall and then flash over the top. Again, it's important to apply enough pressure to activate the adhesive on the tape. Sealing a pipe through a wall can be done with a single piece of stretchy tape, which is far easier and cheaper than flashing boots. The rule of whoever cuts the hole has to seal it up can be made a lot easier and more predictable if all the subs know where to look for the flashing tape.
So that's a good little tip to make it a rule on your job site. Whoever cuts a hole in the envelope has to seal it up and just make sure they know where all the sealing materials are. Maybe it's a little box in the job trailer or something. So again, we'll add some real world job site footage to the Perfect World Animation Land. This is a job site in Maine, sealing the connection between the foundation and the wall. In the house wrap videos, they showed sealing the house wrap to the foundation with caulk, and then that's how we did it in the animation. Then in the video, they did it with tape. As long as it's sealed, it's good. Because there's no house wrap in these panels, the gap has to be sealed instead of covered. And so Liz uses liquid flashing to seal the sheathing to the bottom plate and then also to seal the bottom plate to the foundation.
In previous episodes, we installed wall sheathing and taped the seams between the panels. This episode focuses on another super important place to detail the air barrier, where the walls meet the foundation. Liz snaps a line about 1.5 inches below the wall sheathing and uses duct tape to mask off the line. She masks off about 10 feet and then turns to the tubes. The first bead goes directly under the wall sheathing to seal the sheathing to the bottom plate.
Because you want to get one right up under the sheathing and then one around the gasket.
Run additional sealant below to bridge the space between the foundation, seal gasket, and framing.
I'm going to take our high-tech spoon.
The best way to get a clean cove-like fillet bead of sealant is to use a cheap plastic spoon. They're flexible, rounded, and free. When the sealant is worked into the upper gaps, the lower edge is smoothed out with a plastic squeegee. She works in about 3-foot sections so that she can move her whole setup and not have to walk back and forth. Working her way down the wall, she squeezes sealant, spoons it in place, squeegees the excess, and finally peels the tape. When peeling tape off a wet edge like this, pull the tape slightly toward the wet edge. This will fold the sealant back on itself rather than pulling it down over the line. After the first section of wall is done, she begins the next section, taping the line, sealing the gap, smoothing the surface, and repeating all the way around the house.
Okay. As we saw, a leaky spot in houses is where the wall sits atop the foundation. And sill seal isn't the be all end all answer because there's a lot more cracks, gaps, and holes there than meets the eye. It's not just the joint between the wood and the concrete. There's a bunch of wood meeting each other and butting into each other and nailing into each other. So because of the location of this gap, it's especially susceptible to sucking air in to replace any lost air due to stack effect and leaky ceilings. So let's take a closer look at that. The joint between walls and foundations runs the entire perimeter of the house, obviously. And according to Building America Solution Center, this is especially important for two reasons. One, because the concrete surface is sometimes rough, preventing a smooth seam between the foundation and sill plate, which we've talked about, and because of stack effect, which naturally pulls air through the lower part of the building where the sill plate is located. So here's a little drawing that I made. I also made a little animation illustrating how to seal these. There's 5 layers of protection against one leaky joint, basically. Any one or two of those is going to improve your building's performance. There's probably a gajillion other ways to do it differently. And, if it works, then it's right. Before developing that little animation, I asked Pro Tradecraft's technical committee for their input on how they do it, that part of the house. Here's some of the suggestions were to upgrade from off-the-shelf sill seal to a high-performance sill gasket and seal the foundation to the mud sill. So like some of them are EPDM gaskets. Some of them are like T-shaped where, part of it goes under the mud sill and then there's an adhesive that attaches to the foundation and to the wall sheathing. There's peel and stick high performance sill gaskets. I think they're available. There's a couple of stores online for high performance materials. Sealants like acoustical sealant will ensure long life. Sealing the wall sheathing to the bottom plate is a good idea, which was shown in that illustration. Subfloor adhesive is usually close at hand on a job site, especially during the framing stage. So if you just run a bead of subfloor adhesive along the bottom plate before sheathing the walls, that will stop a big air leak around the perimeter of the house. Overhanging the sheathing a couple of inches below the mud sill is a great idea. And then sealing that sheathing to the foundation as well with acoustical sealant or something that will stick to both wood and masonry. If the wall plates are not flush with the foundation all the way around, meaning that the walls are square but the foundation isn't quite square, which happens in the real world a lot, just use like an low expanding foam in those gaps to seal that up. The bottom line on the bottom plate is that multiple layers of sealing will substantially reduce air leaks along this important part of a house. It'll improve comfort, durability, and energy efficiency. Okay, so bottom of the wall is a place where things leak because there's a lot of wood connected to each other. Another place where things leak a lot is the top of the wall. Everywhere that a piece of lumber sits on another piece of lumber or butts into another piece of lumber is a gap that leaks. And it's not a gap that could leak, it's a gap that leaks. They all leak unless you seal them. And this drawing comes from the Building America Solution Center. They use a flash coat of spray foam on the underside of the roof deck. And that's a good way that's good for new construction or gut jobs. I'm going to turn my phone off. Someone's texting me. It's good for new construction or gut jobs where you have access to the framing. That's not always the case in the remodeling world. And this shows a cathedral ceiling, which also isn't always the case. So a lot of times the insulation isn't located at the roof deck. It's located at the attic floor or the ceiling of the living space. This drawing actually also shows something that doesn't really happen in nature much unless you specify it, is that the rafters sit on top of the ceiling joists rather than next to them, this makes a ton of sense. It makes a lot more room for insulation in this really typically cold and leaky spot. So the spot won't be nearly as cold. It'll generate a lot less condensation in your cavities. It's pretty simple detail, just plopping a plate on top of the ceiling joists and then setting the rafters on top of that plate. Or if you're using trusses, use raised heel trusses. So there's a lot of ways to seal the top of the wall and roof connection. And again, the best method is going to depend on the house that we're talking about, the crew who's doing the work, and the materials that are available. This is a quick video showing some air sealing details being done in the real world. It's a remodeler named Ben Bogey who works in Northwest Connecticut.
Last time on the Model Remodel Show, we were pulling fans out of boxes and putting them in the house. The bath fan went above the shower unit, and then Ben installed the supply fan in the basement. He played a Rubik's elbow ductwork game before sealing the seams in the ducts with mastic. The Air King Q-Fresh supply fan pulls in fresh air and pushes it into a distribution box in the attic, where it supplies various rooms with fresh air. The Q-Fresh fan will be synchronized to a constant low-flow exhaust from the range hood, giving a balanced ventilation system for the tight little house that is Professional Remodeler's 2017 Model Remodel. This week, we're going to get out of the basement and get up on the... Seems like no one's around today. Well, okay. We'll take this opportunity to look back at the project from the start and get a sense of some of the smart, energy-efficient detailing on this tight little house. We began late right out of the gate due to a late winter snowstorm.
We were hoping to have this project started about 4 weeks ago. Initially, we had started out hoping to keep about 2/3 of the structure. The future bathroom and laundry we knew was going to be coming off, and the section where the new kitchen is going to sit, we thought that would be coming down to foundation. Over the winter, as we kind of came in and did a little site survey work and looked at the building a little bit closer and started to weigh some costs, the amount of time that would have been soaked up in that process quickly started to outweigh the costs of going down to bare foundation.
So they methodically cut the house into pieces, chained it to the machine, pulled it apart, and set it aside, beginning with the roof, plucking up the walls, and removing the floor. Going down to the foundation also means that air sealing is much easier because it's basically new construction above the foundation. Because of the humpy-bumpy foundation, they used extra thick mud sills to span the valleys and corners to provide a rigid base. After the mud sills were shimmed level, the masons filled the gaps with grout. A few steady days of rain set us back again, but Ben showed up anyway to lay out the floor frame. One critical place for air sealing is the floor frame assembly, because everywhere that two materials join is a gap that will leak unless it is sealed. Ben seals the rim joist to the mud sill with adhesive, and then he seals the corners as long as he's at it, bedding the rim in glue. Subfloor adhesive is sometimes left off at the perimeter because the floor won't squeak under exterior walls, but that creates one of those continuous gaps that leak. So Ben hits the perimeter before adding subfloor. Here's a recap of the Airtight floor system. There's a sill seal gasket between the foundation and the mud sill. The rim joist is bedded in glue atop the mud sill and at the corners. Zip's subfloor adhesive seals the perimeter, and the Advantech subfloor caps the assembly. Next, we'll frame walls on top using Zip Systems R12 sheathing sealed to the foundation, bridging all those gaps, and taped at the corners and joints. The exterior insulating panels are another energy-smart step. They allowed Ben to step down from 2x6 studs to 2x4s, with almost no heat loss penalty. The
The panels are located to bridge all of the framing gaps down to the foundation, and they're sealed to the framing with silicone. The zip system panels go up like any other sheathing, except that they require extra long nails, which may need to be special ordered, so make sure you're good friends with your mail carrier. Ben is a fan of Zip System's thick R panels.
We've used the Zip R3 and R6 a number of times on various projects over the years. We're big believers in exterior insulation. Putting the thermal control layer on the outside of your framing makes a lot of sense. So we're really happy to get our hands on the R12 panels.
That's where we're going to break off on this episode, and we'll come back next time with 4 more energy-smart strategies on the roof, in the windows, and around the ducts.
That pretty much takes us toward the end of the Airtight Walls in the Real World section. Again, links to all of these videos in this presentation and further reading will be emailed out a little while after class. In the meantime, you can look at some of the same articles that I mentioned in the last session on buildingscience.com and the Building America Solution Center, basc.pnnl.gov. / yada yada yada, has a great section on walls and openings that kind of cover, new construction and retrofit options. Plenty of stuff on Pro Tradecraft as well.